I, Vorruk of the Grath Collective's senior observer and three-time medal holder in the Grand Galactic Endurance Trials, did not personally invite the human. Nobody asked me. Nobody ever asks me. They just sent me the updated roster. I looked at it, and then I looked at it again, because the first time I looked at it I assumed my visual sensors had finally given out after 47 years of service. But no, there it was, right between Prella of the Dunsarathi Hive and Yox-kun of the Sleeping Moons, one single human. Species designation, Homo sapiens. Home world, Earth. Weight, listed at 89 kilograms. Height, 1.8 meters. Brain capacity. Let me not even go there, because the numbers made me feel sad. His name was Tobias Wren. I said his name out loud, just once, standing there in the corridor of the observation ring, holding my data pad, surrounded by the hum of the station's cooling systems. Then I said it again, because it sounded ridiculous. Tobias Wren. 2 syllables. Then 1 syllable. That is the entire name. That is what this creature had decided to call himself for his entire life. Not Vorkun Torah Solith, like a dignified being. Not even a respectable string of clicks and harmonics like the Polari use. Just Tobias Wren. I made a note in my official observer's log. Human has arrived. Name sounds like something that fell off a shelf. Proceeding with documentation. Now, before I tell you what happened at the 7th Grand Endurance Trial of the Keth-Ra Consortium, I should explain what the trial actually is, because if you are reading this and you are not familiar, you need to understand the scale of what I am talking about. The Keth-Ra Endurance Trial is not a race. It is not a simple test of speed or strength. It is, according to the official charter of the consortium, a multi-phase assessment of biological, psychological, and metabolic resilience under progressively hostile environmental conditions. In practical terms, what that means is this: we take the best physical specimens from every consenting species in the known galaxy. We put them in a series of environments specifically designed to push their biology to absolute collapse, and we see who is left at the end. The record for most phases completed by a single contestant was held by a Dunsarathi named Prella, who had made it through 11 consecutive phases before her chitin cracked so badly she had to be carried out on a stretcher. She was celebrated as a hero. Songs were written about her. I had personally shaken one of her 4 hands at the awards ceremony, and she had gripped mine so hard I heard something pop. The average number of phases completed by a first-time contestant was 4. The human had qualified on a technicality. Their species had submitted a formal application to the consortium 6 years prior, and under Article 12 of the Participation Accords, any species with verified spaceflight capability and a minimum planetary population of 500 million was eligible to send 1 representative. Nobody had said no, because nobody had actually believed a human would show up. But here he was. Tobias Wren, 89 kilograms, 1.8 meters, wearing what I later learned humans call a compression shirt, which apparently is just a very tight piece of fabric that does absolutely nothing to protect against vacuum pressure, radiation exposure, temperature variation, gravitational stress, or any of the other things that the trial would shortly be throwing at him. He was stretching in the staging area when I first saw him in person. Just stretching, reaching his arms over his head, bending sideways, making small sounds of satisfaction, like ah and moomph, as various joints in his body produced audible snapping sounds that made 3 nearby Polari flinch involuntarily. I approached him, as was my duty as senior observer. I introduced myself. I explained my role. I handed him the standard briefing packet, which outlined the phases, the safety protocols, the evacuation procedures, and the standard medical waiver that basically said, in very polite official language, if you die, that is your own problem. Tobias Wren looked at the briefing packet. He flipped through it with 1 thumb. He nodded slowly, like a person who has just been told that the soup of the day is tomato, and tomato is fine, tomato is acceptable. Tomato does not surprise or alarm him in any way. Cool, he said. That was his response to 47 pages of detailed ecological hazard warnings. Cool. I wrote in my log, human appears to be under-reading the room, or he is experiencing some form of neurological suppression. We'll monitor. The other contestants were considerably more impressive. In the traditional sense, there were 9 of them total. Prella of the Dunsarathi, the defending champion, stood nearly 2.5 meters tall, covered in layered plates of natural chitin that functioned as both armor and thermal regulation. She could survive temperatures that would turn most soft-bodied organisms into something resembling soup. She had won this event twice. She looked at Tobias Wren with what I can only describe as professional curiosity, the way a very large predator might look at a very small rodent that has wandered into its territory, not threatened, just puzzled. Yox-kun of the Sleeping Moons was a creature of dense, slow-burning metabolic efficiency. His species could enter partial hibernation states while still maintaining basic motor function, allowing them to essentially sleep their way through pain and fatigue. He had completed the trial 3 times and never once finished lower than second place. He was currently standing perfectly still, eyes half closed, already conserving energy. He weighed somewhere in the range of 340 kilograms and had hands like geological formations. There was Pak, from the woven shores of Arenthal, who could regulate her own internal oxygen consumption to such a degree that she had once survived 40 minutes in a near-vacuum environment without mechanical assistance. She was extraordinarily beautiful by Arenthal standards, which meant she was roughly the shape and color of a sea anemone, and she shimmered when she moved. Several of the other contestants gave her a wide berth because the last time someone stood too close to Pak during a trial, they had brushed against her trailing filaments and spent 3 hours paralyzed from the waist down. There was Vorruk, a male of the Keth-Ra heavy worlder subspecies, built like something you would use to stop a runaway freight vehicle. There was Ella, a Polari with combat endurance certifications from 4 separate military academies. There was Vorruk, a deep-sea adaptation specialist from the trench cultures of Mir, who had gills, 4 pairs of pressure-resistant eyes, and an attitude about everything. There was Cool, who didn't share his species and nobody asked, and who exuded a mild chemical warning signal at rest that made everyone in his vicinity slightly nauseous. And there was Tobias Wren, who was now doing something he called jumping jacks, which is apparently a human warm-up exercise and which looked, to every alien in that staging room, like a being experiencing a controlled but enthusiastic seizure. I documented everything. That is my job. I document. The opening ceremony was brief, as it always is. The consortium doesn't believe in lengthy speeches before the suffering begins. Grand Adjudicator Ferrando, a Keth-Ra elder who had been running this event for longer than some of our contestants had been alive, walked to the podium, looked at the assembled competitors with the warmth of a very old glacier, and said the same thing she said every single year. The trial begins at dawn cycle. Whatever you brought, it won't be enough. Good luck. Then she walked away. I have always appreciated Ferrando's approach to ceremony. The first phase began, as it always does, with heat. The thermal endurance chamber is the traditional opening phase of the Keth-Ra trial, and it serves a very specific purpose. It is designed not to eliminate contestants, but to sort them, to give the observers an early look at how different biologies handle thermal stress, so we can make informed predictions about what the later phases will do to each competitor. It is, in the grand scheme of the trial, the easy part. The temperature in the chamber climbs from standard comfortable to 312 degrees Celsius over the course of 6 hours. Contestants are given access to a single communal cooling station in the center of the room, which contains temperature-regulated fluid and a basic misting system. They can use it, or not. The goal is simply to remain standing, conscious and inside the chamber for as long as possible. Prella went directly to one corner, planted her feet wide, and stood absolutely motionless. Her chiton would handle the heat far better than any soft body in that room. She was essentially a walking thermal insulation system. She looked, frankly, bored. Yox-kun entered his partial hibernation state within the first 20 minutes. His breathing slowed to something like 4 cycles per minute. He was technically still competing. He just looked like a very heavy pile of rocks someone had left in a hot room. Pak extended her trailing filaments, which apparently help her species radiate excess heat, and shimmered even more brilliantly than before. She looked like something out of a fever dream, a very expensive biologically optimized fever dream. Tobias Wren sat down on the floor. Just sat down, cross-legged, in the middle of the chamber. Not near the cooling station, not near a wall, right in the middle of the floor, like someone who had found an excellent spot to think and had decided to use it. I noted this in my log. Human has chosen an inexplicable tactical position, possibly resting, possibly processing, possibly just being strange. At the 2-hour mark, the temperature was approximately 160 degrees Celsius. Vorruk of the trench cultures was beginning to show visible signs of stress, his pressure-resistant skin developing a dull flush across the dorsal surface. He moved to the cooling station and immersed his upper torso in the fluid. He would remain there for the next hour before ultimately stepping outside the chamber at the 3-hour mark, shaking his head slowly. Eliminated from Phase 1. Dawn Elad's lasted until just past the 4-hour mark. She had performed magnificently, managing the heat with controlled breathing techniques and strategic use of the misting system, but when the temperature crossed 250 degrees, her combat training ran up against a simple biological wall. She walked out with her head still high and her expression one of precise, professional disappointment. I respected that. There is a dignity in knowing your limit. Cool lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes before whatever chemical warning signal he was producing became a chemical surrender signal, and he shuffled quietly out of the room. Nobody went near him for about 40 minutes after that. Gurek, despite his enormous mass, made it to 5 hours. He was sweating so profusely that small puddles had formed around his feet, and when he finally stepped outside, he made a sound like a very large bag of water being dropped from a moderate height. That left 4. Prella, Kun, Sarindi Pak, and Tobias Wren, who had not moved from his cross-legged position on the floor in 6 hours, who was sweating through his compression shirt in a way that made him look like he had been briefly submerged in something, and who was, I noticed when I zoomed my sensors in on his face, smiling, not the smile of someone who is comfortable, not the serene smile of someone in a meditative state, the smile of someone who is in significant discomfort and has decided, for reasons known only to themselves, that this is acceptable, maybe even amusing. I have seen a lot of contestants in a lot of different states over my career. I have seen triumph, agony, despair, confusion, and once, memorably, a Polari who tried to compete in the thermal phase while secretly running a fever and then had to be escorted out because she was generating more heat than the chamber itself. I had never seen anyone smile like that at 280 degrees Celsius. The chamber hit its maximum of 312 at the 6-hour mark. The phase technically ends at the 6-hour point, but completing it simply means enduring until the temperature drops back to safe levels, which takes another 20 minutes. Any contestant who exits during that final stretch is still counted as not completing the phase. Sarindi Pak exited at the 6-hour and 8-minute mark. She was still shimmering, still technically functional, but her trailing filaments had retracted fully, and she was moving in the careful, deliberate way that says, "I am fine, but I would like to be somewhere else now." She nodded to the remaining contestants as she left. Very graceful, very professional. She had outperformed her previous personal record. 3 remained. Prella, Kun, Tobias Wren. Kun emerged from his hibernation state at the 6-hour and 15-minute mark, stood up slowly, assessed the situation with the calm expression of someone who has just woken from a very good nap, and walked out of the chamber with quiet dignity. He had completed the phase. He was conserving himself for what came next. Prella looked at Tobias Wren. Tobias Wren looked at Prella. There was a moment. I don't know what kind of moment exactly. It is difficult to describe the exchange of expressions between a human and a 2.5-meter armored chitin-plated champion with 4 arms and compound eyes. But something happened in that moment. Something was communicated. Prella walked out of the chamber at the 6-hour and 19-minute mark. She had never exited before the temperature had fully dropped to safe levels. In every previous trial she had competed in, she had been the absolute last one out of the thermal phase, sometimes waiting an additional full hour past the required time just to make a point. She exited at 6:19, because Tobias Wren was not moving. He was still sitting there, cross-legged, sweating through his compression shirt, hands resting on his knees, smiling that lunatic smile, at 312 degrees Celsius, and he looked like he was going to sit there until the station itself gave out. When the temperature finally dropped and Tobias Wren stood up and walked out of the chamber, he stretched his arms over his head again, made the ah sound again and looked at me. "Good warm-up," he said. I stared at him for what I later calculated was approximately 4.3 seconds. Then I wrote in my log, Phase 1 complete. All contestants still technically in the trial. Human appears to have redefined the term warm-up in a manner I find personally alarming. Phase 2 was the pressure endurance phase, and this is where I expected, based on all available biological data, the human to struggle. Pressure endurance is not about pain tolerance. It is about physics. The trial's pressure chamber compresses atmospheric pressure to levels that would occur approximately 4,000 meters below the surface of a standard ocean. For species that evolved in high-pressure environments, like Vorruk's sole, who was no longer competing but who would have found this phase comfortable, it is manageable. For soft-bodied, air-breathing, surface-evolved organisms, it is the kind of thing that produces very interesting medical readings right up until it produces no medical readings at all. Humans, by all the data in the consortium archives, were surface creatures. 1 gravity, 1 atmosphere, nothing extreme. soft skin, no natural armor. An internal skeletal structure that is surprisingly robust for its weight class, but which is absolutely not built for pressure extremes. The pressure chamber would go to 15 atmospheres over 4 hours. My honest, documented prediction. The human exits at 2 hours, maybe 2.5 if he is stubborn. I note for the record that I have been doing this job for 47 years, and my prediction accuracy rate is 91%. I am very good at predicting these things. We began Phase 2. Vorruk, who had re-entered the trial after recovering from Phase 1, lasted 1 hour and 50 minutes before a pressure warning light appeared on his suit sensor array and medical staff pulled him out. He was fine. His ears were not fine. His ears needed approximately 3 days of rest and 2 rounds of targeted membrane therapy. He competed again 2 years later. Dunilla had already been eliminated. She was watching from the observation ring with the expression of someone who has moved past disappointment and arrived at a kind of focused academic curiosity. Cool lasted 2 hours and 12 minutes before signaling distress. Vorruk's soul, who as I mentioned was already out, came by the observation window specifically to watch this phase, and when Cool tapped out, Vorruk's soul made a small gesture that his cultural translator rendered as understandable. Srindipak, operating in the pressure environment with the flexibility of her fluid-filled internal structure, made it to 3 hours and 40 minutes. Genuinely impressive. She emerged slowly, carefully, her filaments curled tight against her body, and she stood for a long moment outside the chamber just breathing. Yox-kun, in his partial hibernation state, had a body that was simply harder to compress than most. His dense tissue structure worked in his favor here. He completed the phase at 4 hours with the same quiet, half-asleep calm he brought to everything. Prella completed the phase in what I would describe as a state of absolute contempt for pressure as a concept. She stood in that chamber for 4 hours like a monument, like a very large, very armored declaration that pressure was simply not relevant to her plans. Tobias Wren completed the phase in a state that I can only describe by telling you what his biometric readings looked like, because his face was unreadable, his heart rate was elevated, his blood pressure was elevated. His capillary response indicators suggested that his surface tissues were under considerable stress. He was breathing in a deliberate, controlled pattern, which my research notes tell me is a human technique called pressure breathing, originally developed for high-altitude aviation environments on their home world. He completed the phase. He sat down afterward on the floor again, with his elbows on his knees and his head hanging forward, and he stayed like that for about 3 minutes, while his body did whatever it needed to do to recover. Then he looked up and the smile was back. Smaller this time, quieter. But there, I walked over to him because I do this sometimes. I document, and sometimes documentation requires conversation. "How are you feeling?" I asked. Tobias Wren tilted his head slightly, like something tried to squeeze me out of a tube. He said, "But honestly, I have had worse." I looked at him. "Worse than 15 atmospheres of pressure. I went through a phase where I trained in altitude tents for about 8 months, he said, sleeping at the equivalent of 5,000 meters every night. The pressure thing feels kind of familiar, actually. In reverse, I did not know what to do with this information, so I wrote it down and moved on. Phase 3 was cold. I will tell you right now that Phase 3 was where I stopped being surprised and started being something else, something that I do not have a precise word for in my language, but that I would describe loosely as concerned, fascinated, and slightly afraid. The cold phase drops the chamber temperature to -80 degrees Celsius. This is not in the absolute scale of cold things that exist in the universe the most extreme cold we could produce, but it is the specific kind of cold that is calibrated to be just manageable enough for the species with the most robust thermal resilience and just lethal enough for everyone else. Contestants are given basic insulating wraps, standard-issue thermal management gear that provides a modest barrier, but it is not enough to simply stand there and wait. They have to move. Constant motion, strategic use of the thermal management gear, and if they are smart, partnership with other contestants who are still functioning. Prella does not do cold well. She never has. Her chitin is excellent at thermal insulation, yes, but Dun-Sarathi biology is fundamentally warm world adapted, and -80 degrees Celsius pushes against her limits in ways that nothing in the first 2 phases had. She lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes before her movement became stiff enough that medical staff made the call. She came out of that chamber looking absolutely furious, which is how Prella expresses all of her most intense emotions. Fury, respect, deep satisfaction. They all look the same on her face, which is terrifying. Yox-kun, the eternal mystery, activated a deeper hibernation state than I had ever seen him use in competition, his metabolic rate dropping to something that the monitoring equipment kept flagging as a potential flatline before correcting itself. He maintained this state, this walking thermal minimum, for 3 hours and 41 minutes before his body began to shake in ways that suggested even his extraordinary metabolic control had found its floor. He exited slowly, deliberately, and spent the next hour wrapped in every thermal blanket the medical team had available. That left Tobias Wren. Tobias Wren, who was moving, constantly moving, not frantic movement, not the desperate pacing of someone trying to stay warm through panic. Controlled movement, deliberate movement, something that I later learned from the Human Cultural Database was called a ruck march, which is apparently a training method where you simply walk with weight on your back continuously for hours, because humans apparently decided at some point in their evolutionary history that sustained walking under load was a good thing to practice. He had improvised a pack from the thermal wrapping material, filling it with the equipment he wasn't wearing, and he was walking in a steady oval around the perimeter of the chamber, arms swinging, breathing in controlled rhythm at -80°C. 2 hours. 3 hours. 3 hours and 42 minutes. He passed Yox-kun's record while I was standing at the observation window with a cup of Keth-Ra standard issue nutrient broth going cold in my hand. 4 hours. My assistant, a young grath named Ventural, who was on his first trial assignment and had been keeping mostly quiet except to hand me documentation forms when I needed them, came and stood beside me at the window. We both watched Tobias Wren walk his steady oval in the cold chamber. "How is he still going?" Ventural asked. "I have no idea," I said. "Should we be worried?" "I have been worried," I said, "since he walked in here looking at his hazard briefing like it was a food menu." At 4 hours and 33 minutes, Tobias Wren stopped walking. He stood still for a moment, he looked at his hands, then he looked up, directly at the observation window, directly at me, as though he could see me through the shielded glass and the darkness beyond. He held up one hand. I thought for a single terrible moment that he was signaling distress. Then I realized he was waving. He was waving at me. At 4 hours and 33 minutes into a -80° endurance phase, this creature was waving at the observer's window. I waved back. I am not sure why. It seemed rude not to. He walked for another 27 minutes. 5 hours total. He exited the cold chamber at the 5-hour mark with ice crystals in his hair and frost on his eyelashes, and the kind of expression that a human makes, I later learned, when they are cold but not broken. He was shaking slightly, the fine involuntary muscle tremor of an organism whose core temperature has dropped to the lower edge of its functional range. But he was walking, steady, deliberate. Medical staff descended on him immediately. They wrapped him in heated blankets. They pressed warm fluid containers into his hands. They checked his temperature, his heart rate, his oxygen, his blood pressure, his everything. He sat down with his blankets and his warm cup and his ice crystal hair, and he looked over at Prella, who was glowering at him from across the recovery area. "Good run," he said to her. Prella made a sound that the translator rendered as "You are a deeply peculiar organism." "Thanks," said Tobias Wren, and took a sip of his warm fluid. 3 phases done. Prella, Yox-kun, and Tobias Wren still competing. Every other contestant eliminated. I stood in the corridor outside the recovery area with my datapad in my hands, and I looked at my Phase 3 documentation. I looked at the numbers, I looked at the projections. And then I set my datapad down on a nearby surface, and I simply stood there for a moment, doing nothing. Ventural appeared at my elbow. "Are you all right, Senior Observer?" "I am documenting internally," I said. "What are you documenting?" I picked up my datapad. "The strong possibility," I said, "that this trial is about to become something none of us have seen before." Ventural was quiet for a moment. Then, because of the human, I confirmed. I wrote in my official log, "End of day 1. 3 phases complete, 3 contestants remaining. Humans still in competition, which defies my projections, the consortium's projections, and I suspect the basic laws of what we thought we understood about Homo sapiens biology. Recommend all observers update their species assessment files. Immediately. Also recommend someone bring more documentation forms. I have a feeling we are going to need them." I closed my datapad. Then I opened it again, and I added one more line. He waved at me, from inside the cold chamber, at -80°C. He waved. "This is not unusual for me during a trial. I am a professional worrier. I have been a professional worrier my entire career, which spans 47 years of watching magnificent biological specimens push themselves to the edge of what their bodies can do and then either stop or break. The stopping is fine, the breaking is paperwork. I have filled out more biological incident reports than I care to remember, and each one of them begins with the same sentence. The contestant did not recognize their limit in time. What kept me awake this particular night was not the fear of paperwork. It was the question that had been sitting at the back of my mind since the moment Tobias Wren walked into the thermal phase, sat down cross-legged on the floor, and smiled. The question was this: does this human know where his limit is? Because every contestant I have ever observed, from first-timers to champions with decorated careers, has a moment where you can see it in their body, in their face, in the way they breathe, a moment where the biology makes a quiet biological announcement: this is as far as we go. And the great ones, the truly great ones, hear that announcement and push maybe 10 or 15% past it before they listen. That is what separates the champions from the participants. But Tobias Wren did not look like someone receiving an internal announcement. He looked like someone who had turned off the notification settings. I wrote in my personal log, the one I keep separate from the official documentation: either this human has extraordinary physiological resilience, or he has no idea what his body is telling him. I cannot determine which. Both possibilities are terrifying for different reasons. Then I went and got a nutrient supplement, stood in the station kitchen for 12 minutes staring at the wall, and went back to my bunk. Day 2 of the trial began at standard dawn cycle, which on a station means the overhead lighting shifts from nighttime blue to the warm amber of simulated morning, and somewhere in the ventilation system a sequence of subtle frequency tones plays to help circadian rhythms calibrate. It is, in theory, a gentle and civilized start to the day. Prella was already in the training area when I arrived at 6 cycle. She was doing resistance work, pulling against weighted cables with all 4 arms simultaneously, her chitin plates flexing with each pull, her compound eyes forward and focused. She had been eliminated from the cold phase but was still technically in the trial, since the consortium's rules allow contestants to re-enter competition after an elimination up to twice per event. She had used one of her 2 re-entries. Yox-kun was sitting on a bench in the corner, eating something that looked like compressed mineral paste from a small container, with the methodical efficiency of a machine refueling. Tobias Wren was doing something on the floor that involved lying flat on his stomach, then pushing his entire body up with just his arms, then lowering back down, then doing it again, repeatedly, quickly, without apparent difficulty. Push-ups. The Human Cultural Database had an entry for this. An ancient exercise, pre-industrial, used by human military organizations for thousands of years as a basic fitness test and training tool. He was doing them very fast. I counted, involuntarily, because I count things. I counted 67 before he stopped, stood up, shook out his arms, and looked around the room with the alert, interested expression of someone who has just arrived at a party and is deciding who to talk to first. "Morning," he said, to no one in particular, and then went to get something from the nutrition station. Prella looked at him. Then she looked at me. I looked back at her. She made a sound that the translator rendered as, "I find this situation extremely irregular," and went back to her cable pulls. Phase 4 was the gravitational variance phase. I need to explain Phase 4 carefully, because it is where the trial becomes, in the words of Grand Adjudicator Ferrando, genuinely unpleasant. The first 3 phases test thermal and pressure resilience. Phase 4 tests structural and neuromuscular resilience. The gravity in the chamber is gradually increased from standard 1G to 4.5 G over 3 hours, then held at 4.5 for an additional 2 hours, 5 hours total. At 4.5 times standard gravity, you weigh 4.5 times what you normally weigh. Every step requires 4.5 times the muscular effort. Your cardiovascular system has to work 4.5 times as hard to circulate blood against the additional pull. Your skeleton is bearing 4.5 times its normal load, and you have to maintain enough function to stay upright, stay conscious, and stay in the chamber for the duration. Prella, at 4.5 times her normal weight, would still be moving around roughly the same mass as a standard gravity Yox-kun. She was built for this. Her broad base, her dense chitin, her 4-limbed stability, this was the phase designed, it sometimes seemed, specifically for her. Yox-kun, who was already extremely heavy, would become something close to geological at 4.5 G. His challenge would be keeping blood circulating to his extremities and his brain, which at that mass and gravity becomes a significant ask for even the most robust cardiovascular system. Tobias Wren, at 89 kilograms, would become approximately 400 kilograms at peak gravity, compressed into a 1.8-meter frame on 2 legs. 2 legs. I want you to understand something. Bipedal locomotion at 4.5 g is not something most bipedal species can maintain. The structural geometry is wrong. Most high-G adapted species are low to the ground, broad, multi-limbed. The upright two-legged design works beautifully at 1g because it frees the upper limbs for tool use and gives excellent range of vision. At 4.5g, it becomes a structural challenge that most bipedal species skeletons simply cannot meet. Humans, I noted from the database, had a bone density that was actually quite respectable. The database attributed this to an evolutionary history involving large predators, bipedal pursuit predation, and a planet with a surface gravity slightly higher than the galactic standard 1g measurement. This did not make me feel significantly better, but I noted it. The gravity phase began. At 1g, all 3 contestants looked normal. Prella stood with arms crossed, radiating the calm of someone who could nap in a hurricane. Yox-kun stood with feet planted wide, eyes half closed, already managing his body with that extraordinary internal discipline. Tobias Wren was standing with his feet shoulder-width apart, head level, breathing steadily. He had his hands at his sides. He looked, I thought, like a person standing in a queue. At 2g, the shift was visible. Yox-kun had widened his stance further. Prella had lowered her center of mass slightly, bending all 4 of her knees just fractionally. Tobias Wren had done something with his posture, aligning his spine in a way that the medical readouts later told me was an unconscious load-bearing adjustment. His muscle activity sensors showed his legs working significantly harder. His face was neutral. At 3g, Tobias Wren was moving differently, not struggling, not faltering, but moving as though every step had become a considered decision. He was walking a slow circuit of the chamber, and each footfall was deliberate, placed with care, the gait of someone who knows that the ground is serious right now and the ground deserves respect. At 3.8g, Yox-kun stopped moving entirely and simply stood, a breathing statue, managing survival with the minimum possible expenditure. At 4g, the real nature of the phase became visible on every face in that chamber. Prella compound eyes were focused and sharp, but her jaw plates had tightened in a way that Dun-Sarathi physiologists would recognize as physical strain. She was still holding her upright posture. She was working for it now. Yox-kun had entered a stillness so complete that his breathing monitor kept triggering soft alarms that Ventural had to keep manually clearing. Tobias Wren had stopped walking the circuit. He was standing still, feet planted, head level, eyes forward. He was shaking. Not much, not dramatically, but the fine involuntary tremor of muscle groups under extreme sustained load, the kind of shaking that happens when tissue is working at or near its absolute functional ceiling. Both legs, his lower back, his neck muscles, working to keep his head upright at 4 times its normal weight. He was shaking, and he was not moving, and he was not sitting down, and he was not walking toward the exit. 4.5, said Ventural, very quietly. The gravity shifted to its peak. Prella made a sound, low, guttural, the sound of a body expressing something it would not say out loud. She dropped to her lower 2 limbs, bracing her upper 2 against her knees, bringing herself closer to the ground. She was not exiting, she was adapting, but the adaptation told me everything about what 4.5g was doing to even her. Yox-kun, impossibly swayed. Just once. His enormous frame shifted on its axis by perhaps 5 degrees and then held, but that sway had never happened before. In 3 previous trials, it had never happened. Tobias Wren made no sound. He was vibrating now, both legs trembling continuously with the effort of holding his own weight at 4 times its normal value, and his face had moved past neutral into something else, something that I had to pull up the human expression database to identify, because I had only seen this expression in historical documentary footage and combat training records from the Earth database. It was not a smile, it was not pain, it was not concentration. It was resolve, pure, simple, biological resolve, the expression of a creature that has been told by its own body, this is the limit, and has responded, noted. We are continuing anyway. The 5-hour hold began. Prella made it 3 hours and 14 minutes into the hold before her left lower limb buckled. Not a collapse, a controlled descent. She went to one knee, stayed there for 11 seconds, then stood again. But the medical team watching her sensors called the exit. Her cartilage stress readings were in a range that suggested continuing would mean structural damage that the consortium's liability charter did not cover. She walked out of the chamber with all four arms at her sides and her head absolutely straight, staring forward, looking at nothing, because Prella does not look at anything when she is processing a defeat. She looks at nothing, and she processes, and later she will train harder than anyone should, and she will come back. She always comes back. Yaks-kun made it 4 hours and 2 minutes into the hold. He did not buckle. He did not exit under medical call. He simply opened his eyes fully, looked around the chamber as though waking from a very long, very difficult dream, and walked to the door with the careful, measured steps of something very heavy trying to be very precise. He pressed the exit panel himself. He has always insisted on pressing the panel himself. In 4 trials he has always pressed the panel himself. I respect this about him. That left Tobias Wren. At 4 hours and 3 minutes into the hold, still standing, still shaking, I was standing so close to the observation window that my breath was fogging the glass. Ventoral was beside me. We were not speaking. The other observers who had come to watch, because word had gotten around the station that something unusual was happening in Phase 4, were not speaking either. There were 9 of us at that window, and none of us said anything, because there was nothing to say. There was only what was happening in that chamber. Tobias Wren, who weighed 89 kilograms at 1 standard gravity and was currently bearing a load that would have made most planetary surface vehicles reconsider their design specifications, was standing in the center of a 4.5 gravity chamber and breathing. His medical readings were in ranges I had never seen produced by a voluntary competitor. His heart rate was in a zone that the consortium's standard alert system had categorized as requires immediate evaluation, but his oxygen saturation and brain function indicators showed no signs of critical failure. His cardiovascular system was working, genuinely, like something that had been specifically built for exactly this. His blood pressure readings were extraordinary. Not safe. Extraordinary. 4 hours and 30 minutes. He moved. Not toward the exit. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, slowly, deliberately, redistributing load, taking pressure off one set of muscles for a brief moment before shifting it back. The way a person stands when they have been standing for a very long time and they know they are going to be standing for longer still. 4 hours and 45 minutes. He had now been in the hold longer than any contestant in the recorded history of this phase. The previous record was held by Prella, 4 hours and 32 minutes, set at the 5th grand trial, which everyone at the consortium had considered essentially unbeatable. He just broke the record, Ventoral said. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. Yes, I said. He's still going. Yes, I said. Should we do something? We are observers, I said. We observe. So we observed. At the 5-hour mark, the hold phase officially ended, and the gravity began its slow climb back down towards standard. Tobias Wren stood in that chamber as the weight lifted off him, and the shaking in his legs slowly, gradually, reduced, and his breathing gradually, slowly, steadied. And when the gravity reached 2G and his body recognized that the worst was passing, he did something that none of the 9 observers watching through that glass expected. He sat down on the floor. Just folded his legs and sat down, the same cross-legged position he had used in the thermal chamber on day 1, hands on knees, head slightly bowed. He stayed like that for the remaining time until the gravity returned to standard. When the chamber opened, medical staff moved toward him immediately. He held up one hand to stop them. He sat on that floor for another 90 seconds. Then he stood up. He stood up carefully, with the cautious attention of someone who is making absolutely sure each system is working before committing full weight to it, testing each leg deliberately before transferring load. Then he stood fully upright, and he was just a person standing, just a person in a room. He looked at me through the open chamber door. What's next? He said. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. Phase 5, I said. Sleep deprivation and cognitive endurance. He nodded slowly. How long? He asked. 72 hours, I said, with progressive cognitive testing every 6 hours. Tobias Wren looked at the ceiling of the corridor, briefly, as though doing some mental calculation. Okay, he said. That was it. Just, okay. I wrote in my log. Phase 4 complete. Record broken. Humans still competing. Humans' reaction to being informed of a 72-hour sleep deprivation phase was okay, delivered in the same tone one might use upon being told that parking will be available at the venue. I have revised my personal threat assessment of Homo sapiens species from negligible to deeply reconsidering everything I know about biology. Phase 5 was, in the opinion of most experienced trial observers, the phase that reveals everything. The thermal, pressure, cold, and gravity phases test the body. Phase 5, the cognitive endurance trial, tests what happens when the body is exhausted and the mind has to keep working anyway. Contestants are kept in a lit, temperature-stable environment, provided with adequate nutrition and hydration, and subjected to no additional physical stressors. The only challenge is, stay awake, do not sleep, and every 6 hours, complete a standardized cognitive assessment that tests memory, pattern recognition, mathematical processing, and decision-making response time. For most species, the first 24 hours are manageable. The second 24 become difficult. The third 24 becomes something that the consortium's medically cautious charter technically categorizes as potentially problematic but permits because the safety monitors are constant and the exit option is always available. Prella, coming back in on her second re-entry, made it 41 hours before her cognitive assessments began showing score degradation severe enough that her species' baseline adjustment rating fell below the minimum threshold. She was still conscious. She was still functioning. She was just making math errors that Prella would find unacceptable, and when her score came back below her personal threshold, she exited voluntarily. I had never seen her exit voluntarily from anything before. It told me more about how much that gravity phase had cost her than anything else could have. Yokes-kun entered his partial hibernation state, and the consortium spent 3 hours in administrative debate about whether a contestant could use biological hibernation in the sleep deprivation phase, since technically his brain was still processing, just at a much reduced rate. They ruled, ultimately, that it was within the rules but would be factored into his cognitive assessment scoring as a modified baseline. He made it 61 hours. 61 hours, which was, before this trial, the standing record for the sleep deprivation phase. Then there was Tobias Wren. Tobias Wren, who, at the 48-hour mark, was sitting at the assessment table with a cup of the station's standard warm nutrient broth and completing his cognitive pattern recognition test with the focused frown of someone doing a moderately challenging puzzle. Not an easy puzzle. He was clearly working. His processing speed scores were down from his initial baseline, which was expected. No human brain maintains optimal processing speed through 2 days of wakefulness. His error rate was up slightly, but his scores were still technically above the minimum threshold. He was slowing down, but he was not stopping. I sat with him during the hour 50 checkpoint on the second night because the shift schedule put Ventural on rest rotation, and I have never been good at delegating the things that matter most. I brought my documentation kit, and I sat across the assessment table from Tobias Wren, and I watched him drink his broth. "You should talk to me," he said, without looking up from his broth. "Why?" I said. "Because when someone's been awake for 50 hours, conversation helps," he said. "Keeps the brain engaged. My cognitive load goes up when I'm actively responding to something. You are a good observer." He looked up. His eyes were red around the edges in the particular way that human sleep deprivation produces. "You have been watching me since day one. You are thorough. You care about doing your job right." I was, unexpectedly, somewhat touched by this. I did not say so. "What would you like to talk about?" I asked. "Why does this event exist?" he said. "The trial, what's the actual point of it?" I considered this. Originally, I said, it was established by the Keth-Ra Consortium as a means of assessing the upper limits of biological potential across multiple species. The data gathered goes to consortium medical research. It has contributed to over 300 significant findings in cross-species physiology. That's the official answer, he said. Yes. What's the real answer? I looked at him. His eyes were tired but sharp. Very sharp for someone approaching 52 hours of wakefulness. The real answer, I said slowly, is that it is about respect. Every species that competes here, and completes even one phase, is recognized as something worth paying attention to. The galaxy is a very large place with a great number of species in it, and most of them do not notice one another unless someone does something that demands to be noticed. Tobias Wren was quiet for a moment. "And humans haven't been noticed," he said. "Not particularly," I said. "Your species has been space-capable for a relatively short period. You have not yet done something that demanded the galaxy's attention." He turned his cup slowly in both hands. "Until now, maybe," he said. "Not arrogant, just observational, like a scientist noting data." "That," I said carefully, "remains to be seen." He smiled. Even at 52 hours without sleep, he could still produce that smile. Fair enough, he said. The 61-hour mark came. Kun had exited at 61 hours. That was now the record to beat. Tobias Wren's cognitive assessment at 60 hours had shown a noticeable decline in mathematical processing speed, a mild increase in pattern recognition errors, and a response time on the decision-making test that was running about 22% slower than his initial baseline. These were significant declines. They were not, however, failure declines. He was still above threshold. At 62 hours, I entered the assessment room to personally deliver his evaluation report, as senior observer protocol requires for any competitor who breaks an existing phase record. He was sitting upright in his chair, not slumped, not swaying. His eyes were heavy, the lids drooping with the weight of 62 hours of wakefulness, but they were open, and they were tracking me as I walked in, and they were, under the exhaustion, alert. "You have broken the record," I said. I put the evaluation sheet on the table in front of him. 62 hours. The previous record was Kun, 61 hours, set at the third grand trial. Tobias Wren looked at the evaluation sheet. Then he looked at me. "How much longer until phase end?" he asked. 10 hours, I said. He absorbed this. "Okay," he said. "You understand," I said carefully, "that the cognitive decline at this stage is significant. Your scores are still above threshold, but the trajectory suggests that by hour 68, you may be approaching the minimum acceptable range." "I know," he said. "You would not be failing by exiting now," I said. "You have already broken the record. You have already done something that no one expected of you or of your species." He looked at me for a long moment, his tired red-rimmed sharp eyes. "Vorruk," he said. He used my name. In 58 hours of competition and observation, he had never used my name. "Why do you think I came here?" I opened my mouth to say something procedural and accurate, and observer appropriate, but he was still talking. "I didn't come here to break one record," he said. "I didn't come here to be the human who made it to phase 5 and then exited at a reasonable time. I came here because someone has to go first. Someone has to be the first one from Earth who shows up in a place like this and finds out what we are actually made of." He picked up his broth cup, found it empty, set it back down, "And I want to know what that is. I want to know what I'm made of. That seems like a good reason." I sat down across from him. I do not usually sit down during official documentation. "It is," I said. "That is a good reason." He nodded once. 10 hours, he said. 10 hours, I confirmed. I sat with him for 6 of those 10 hours. I am not sure precisely when sitting with him became something I did not want to stop doing, but at some point, between hour 63 and hour 65, in the quiet of the assessment room, with the station's ambient hum around us and a tired human drinking his third cup of broth, I stopped thinking of Tobias Wren as a subject of documentation and started thinking of him as someone who deserved a witness. He talked, because talking helped, and I listened, because listening is something I am genuinely good at. He told me about a place on Earth called a mountain. He told me about climbing it when he was younger, before he had any particular reason to climb mountains, just because the mountain was there and the question of whether he could make it to the top was something he needed to answer. He told me about the point near the summit where every sensible part of his brain had produced a clear and reasonable argument for turning back. He told me about what it felt like to continue past that point. "It doesn't stop hurting," he said. "The cold, the altitude, the exhaustion. It doesn't stop. You just stop letting it make the decisions." I wrote that down. Not in my official log, in my personal one. Hour 68. His cognitive assessment came back at exactly threshold, 1.1% above the minimum. His pattern recognition had degraded further. His mathematical processing was slow enough that the standard test was flagging extended response times. His decision-making, interestingly, had degraded the least of the 3 categories. He was tired and slow and making more errors than any other version of himself, and his decision-making was still the sharpest thing about him. He looked at the score report. "Still in?" he asked. "Still in," I confirmed. 1.1% above minimum. He sat back in his chair, tilted his head toward the ceiling, and exhaled a very long breath through his nose. 2 hours, he said. 2 hours, I said. He leaned forward. He picked up his broth cup. He held it out toward me. "Can you get me a refill?" he asked. I got him a refill. In 47 years of official observation, I have never fetched a contestant refreshment during an active phase. It is not in the protocol. It is not even suggested in the consortium guidelines. I simply got up, went to the nutrition station, filled the cup with warm broth, and brought it back. He took it with both hands and nodded once, the specific human nod that means thank you when someone is too tired to use more words than absolutely necessary. I sat back down, and we waited. The final cognitive assessment, at the 72-hour mark, came back at exactly 91% of his initial baseline. Not strong, not impressive, in the absolute sense, in the relative sense, considering that he was running on 72 hours of zero sleep after 4 preceding phases of thermal, pressure, cold, and gravitational extremes. It was something that the standard assessment algorithm was not designed to properly contextualize, because the algorithm assumed that no contestant would arrive at this phase having already done everything that had been done before it. The algorithm, I noted, needed to be updated. The phase ended. Tobias Wren sat in his chair for a full 3 minutes after the official end-of-phase tone sounded, finishing his broth, staring at the table surface with the still, inward gaze of someone who has been very far away and is now, slowly, coming back. Then he set down the cup, put his palms on the table, and stood up. He stood up straight. He walked out of the assessment room on his own 2 legs, under his own power, and when he reached the corridor where the other contestants and the full observation staff and half the station's off-duty personnel had gathered, because word had spread the way word always spreads on a station when something extraordinary is happening, he stopped. He looked at the gathered faces, at Prella, who was standing at the front with her arms folded and her compound eyes wide and focused, at Kun, who had abandoned his usual half-hibernation and was fully, completely awake, at Pak, whose filaments were moving in the slow, complex pattern that her species produces in moments of high emotional engagement, at Garek, and Dunella, and Vorruk Sol, and Cool, and every other contestant who had been eliminated days before and had stayed anyway, because none of them wanted to leave before they found out what this human was going to do. Tobias Wren looked at all of them. Then he looked at Grand Adjudicator Ferrando, who had materialized at some point in the crowd, because Ferrando always knows where to be when history is occurring. "Did I finish?" he asked her. Ferrando looked at him with the expression of someone who has organized 19 grand trials and has now seen something she did not expect to see before retirement. "You finished," she said. He took a breath. All 5 phases. All 5 phases. He absorbed this. Then he did something that I was not expecting, and that I suspect nobody in that corridor was expecting, because it was not triumphant, and it was not theatrical, and it was not the gesture of someone performing for a crowd. He just nodded once, with his eyes closed, the private nod of someone having a small, personal conversation with themselves, like checking something off a list that only he could see. When he opened his eyes, Prella was standing directly in front of him. She was taller than him by most of a meter. She had 4 arms and a carapace that had survived things that would have ended most soft-bodied organisms before the first phase was over. She had won this trial twice and come within a single phase of a 3rd championship. She stood in front of Tobias Wren, and she extended one of her upper arms toward him, palm outward, the Dunsarathi gesture of recognition. Not respect given to an inferior, not the polite acknowledgement you offer to someone who has done something moderately impressive. The full, formal gesture, the one reserved for beings who have done something that genuinely changes what you believed was possible. Tobias Wren looked at her hand. Then he raised his own hand and pressed his palm against hers. Nobody translated what Prella said next. She spoke in her home language, which is a dense, layered sequence of harmonics that very few translation systems handle completely, and she spoke quietly enough that even the closest sensors only caught fragments, but I was close enough. And I speak some Dunsarathi, from years of working alongside their competitors. What she said, as best I could translate it, was this: "I did not know your species could do this. I know now. The galaxy will learn what I know." Tobias Wren couldn't understand the words, but something in the tone and the weight of the gesture communicated enough. He looked at her, this exhausted, red-eyed, compression shirt-wearing creature who had sat on the floor of a thermal chamber and waved from inside a cold room and stood trembling through 4.5 gravities and stayed awake for 72 hours past the end of everything else, and he said something very quietly in return. He said, "We are just getting started. I wrote it down. That is my job. I write things down. But I also, and this is something I have never done in 47 years of official documentation, I also simply stood there for a moment afterward, not writing, not observing, not processing anything through the professional framework that usually sits between me and the things I witness. I just stood in that corridor with the hum of the station around me and the gathered crowd breaking into noise and motion, and I felt something that my species typically describes as the adjustment of the known world. The particular sensation of realizing that what you understood about reality is smaller than reality itself. In my official final report for the 7th Grand Endurance Trial of the Keth-Ra Consortium, I wrote the following: Contestant Tobias Wren, Homo sapiens, Earth, completed all 5 phases of the Grand Endurance Trial. He is the first member of his species to compete in this event and the first to complete all 5 phases. He has set records in 2 separate phases. His performance falls outside the predictive models currently held by the consortium for his species category and has necessitated a full revision of the Homo sapiens biological assessment file. I recommend that Earth be invited to send a full delegation to the 8th Grand Trial. I also recommend that the delegation bring more than one contestant, because if one human can do this, I have considerable professional curiosity about what a room full of them might manage. I sent that report to the consortium's administrative office. Then I sent a shorter, unofficial message to Grand Adjudicator Ferrando. It said, "You said whatever they brought wouldn't be enough. You were wrong about this one." She replied within 4 minutes. She wrote, "I know, I am updating my opening remarks." Tobias Wren slept for 14 hours after the trial ended. I am told he woke up, ate an extraordinary amount of food by the nutritional standards of almost every other species on the station, and then, according to Ventural, who witnessed it, went back to the training area and did 67 push-ups. I asked Ventural if he was joking. Ventural showed me the footage. 67 push-ups. Fast ones. I sat with this information for a while. Then I opened my personal log, the one I keep separate from the official documentation, and I wrote the final entry for the 7th Grand Endurance Trial. In 47 years of this work, I have seen strength, and I have seen resilience, and I have seen the very best that biology can produce when it is pushed to its absolute ceiling. I have seen champions. I have seen the moments where great beings find out what they are made of. I have never seen anything like this. The human did not win because he was the strongest. He was not. He did not win because he was the most biologically optimized. He was not that either. He won because he had decided somewhere before any of this began that whatever happened in that chamber was something he could continue through. He had made that decision in advance, and then he simply enacted it. Phase after phase, hour after hour. He had already done the hard part before the trial even started. The hard part, it turns out, is deciding. Everything else is just the part where you keep going. I have a great deal more to learn about humans. I suspect the galaxy does too. I closed my log. Then I went to find Tobias Wren, because there were additional questions I wanted to document, and also, honestly, because I had promised him a proper conversation when he was not running on 3 hours of biological fumes, and I am a being who keeps his promises. He was in the station's viewing bay when I found him, standing at the wide observation port that looks out over the unfiltered starfield, watching the quiet, enormous dark. He heard me coming, because humans are surprisingly alert even when they appear to be doing nothing, and he glanced over his shoulder. "Vorruk," he said. "Tobias Wren," I said. He turned back to the stars. "It's something, isn't it?" he said, not a question, just a statement. One being saying to another being, "Look at this enormous, magnificent, complicated thing we are both part of." "It is," I agreed. We stood there for a while, the human and the observer, watching the same dark that all of us, every species, every biology, every champion and every first-timer who ever walked into a trial chamber watches from whatever window we can find. "Same time next year," he said. I looked at him. He was grinning. That specific grin, the one he had worn on day 1, the one that meant, "I know what this is, I know it is going to hurt, and I have already decided." I reached into my documentation kit. I took out a registration form. I handed it to him.